Tela ou papel? Tinta ou pixel? Robert Darnton, considerado um dos maiores historiadores americanos, vive num dilema. Ele é amante do papel, mas trabalha para digitalizar o maior acervo de livros do mundo. Ele é diretor executivo da Biblioteca de Harvard, que tem 100 unidades e cerca de 17 milhões de obras. Professor e pesquisador, Darnton também foi repórter e trabalhou no New York Times. Especialista na França do século XVIII, é autor de obras como O Grande Massacre de Gatos e A Questão dos Livros. No Roda Viva de hoje, falará de história, de tecnologia e do futuro do conhecimento na era do Google. Boa noite, o Roda Viva de hoje traz na sua bancada os entrevistadores convidados, professora Beatriz Kuchnir, que é doutora em História pela Unicamp e diretora do Arquivo Geral da cidade do Rio de Janeiro, Lília Schwartz, historiadora e professora de Antropologia da USP, autora de As Barbas do Imperador, Paulo Werneck, editor do Caderno Ilustríssima da Folha de São Paulo, Wilson Moerdaui, que é diretor editorial da revista Informática Hoje, Cassiano Elec Machado, jornalista e editor, além do nosso cartunista Paulo Caruso. Esse programa foi gravado para depois pôr as legendas e, portanto, não temos como responder as perguntas da plateia virtual. Boa noite, professor Robert Darnton, é uma honra tê-lo aqui. E o senhor é especialista, além de história, um dos grandes historiadores americanos, o senhor é especialista em digitalização, livros, história do livro. Como é que o senhor compararia a situação que nós estamos vivendo hoje, de passagem para o meio digital, com a experiência histórica? A invenção da escrita, a invenção dos tipos móveis, do Gutenberg. Que momento nós estamos vivendo?
It's a big question, but I'm honored to be able to try to answer it. You know, I think we are living through a period of technological change as great as in the era of Gutenberg. And if you want to go farther back, you could say there are not many great turning points. 4000 BC, the invention of writing. 1000 BC, the invention of the alphabet. Around the time of Jesus Christ, the invention of the Codex, a book whose pages you turn instead of rolling. Then Gutenberg in the 1450s. Things are speeding up. 1974, the internet. 1991, the World Wide Web. In the 1990s, you have special Google-type search with relevance ranking, social networking. It gets faster and faster. And I think people today are quite puzzled as to where we are going. We're trying to see into the digital future, and I think we all have the sensation of living through a time driven by technological change, but I think there's more to it than technology.
O senhor acha que está se democratizando mais o conhecimento com essa digitalização ou não?
Well, potentially, yes. So I see two forces at work. This is oversimplifying, but I think that the democratization of access to knowledge is spectacular. Will it actually happen? We don't know. Potentially, the internet has the power to open up the world of knowledge to the whole world, everyone who has access to the internet. But the other force, which I call commercialization, I think is very dangerous, because it could be that commercial companies whose main business is not access to knowledge, but making money, that's their nature, they could monopolize this new world of, if you like, technological access to knowledge. And so we have forces at work. I don't mean to simplify too much, but I think it's crucial right now for Brazil, for the United States, for everyone, to make sure that the public good is served first, and that it's not just a matter of making money.
O senhor está se... Desculpa, mãe. O senhor está se referindo claramente, não explicitamente, ao Google. O senhor já demonstrou uma preocupação repetidas vezes com um provável, possível monopólio da disseminação do conhecimento pelo Google, que hoje é o oráculo do mundo moderno. Esse é o perigo a que o senhor se refere. Quer dizer, ao mesmo tempo em que uma única entidade promove a disseminação ampla para todo o globo de informação e de conhecimento, ao mesmo tempo tem interesses comerciais e por isso pode ser um risco para a disseminação do conhecimento. É isso?
Well, yes, in short, but in many ways I admire Google. I know the Googlers. I've actually negotiated with them. I've met with them. You know, they're all younger than 30 years old. You go into their office, they don't sit on chairs like this. They sit on inflated balls that are colored yellow and red and green. And they have free food everywhere. And they're very intelligent and tough lawyers. So I admire their technology, their chutzpah, their ambition, and I think they are dangerous. Why? Well, they're a company, and their natural business is to make money for their shareholders. So that's normal. There's nothing evil in it, although, as you know, Google's motto is, do not be evil. So why is it that I feel a danger? Well, Google decided to digitize all the books in the research libraries of the United States. They came first to Harvard, and we said, yes, we will let you digitize our books free of charge, but only books in the public domain. Then Google went to the University of Michigan, Stanford, California, and these other universities permitted Google to digitize all of their books. So instantly, you got a legal battle over copyright. Now, the story gets complicated at this point, but as soon as the legal suit began, Google started secret negotiations with the Authors Guild, the Association of American Publishers. For 3.5 years, they fought over what they called a settlement. And this settlement transformed what originally was a search service. So you, the viewer, could go to Google and punch in a word, and you would see in what book that word appeared with snippets, short extracts. And then Google would even tell you in what library you could find the book. I thought this was terrific. However, the settlement transformed that search service into a commercial library. And the commercial library used all of these books, which we in research libraries let Google use for free, into a gigantic digital database, and then asked us to buy back access to our own books for a price that would be set by Google and that could escalate out of control. So the public was not consulted. There was no public monitoring of this. And I thought this was a danger of monopolization of access to knowledge.
E se não for o Google, o senhor já demonstrou também a preocupação legítima de que se um dia o Google desaparecer, quem é que vai cuidar de todo esse acervo de obras digitalizadas ao longo do tempo? Mas se não for o Google, quem é que o senhor acha, que entidade o senhor acha que pode assumir esse papel? Uma entidade supranacional como a ONU, a Unesco, por exemplo, deveria iniciar uma campanha para assumir a responsabilidade sobre a digitalização de todo esse acervo?
Posso completar?
Claro.
Na sua reflexão sobre a história da questão dos livros, o senhor aponta de que, de uma certa maneira, a academia falhou, que nós poderíamos ter iniciado esse processo de digitalização e acabamos entregando isso a um poder privado, né? Por que às vezes é tão difícil para a academia, para a universidade, trabalhar em rede? né? Às vezes, numa mesma cidade, várias instituições compram o mesmo maquinário, podendo se associar. Quer dizer, nós falhamos, então o Google só tomou esse espaço porque nós falhamos. E como lidar com isso, né?
Well, two very good questions, and I agree. We should have taken the initiative. We should have been first. But maybe we were too timid or too conservative. Google has no timidity at all. They plunge ahead. So they, in a way, showed the possibility of someone else doing it. Now, I should explain that this settlement, which I described, had to go before a court. And the Federal District Court in New York said, no, it's illegal. It's a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. So to get back to your question, I'll begin at the beginning. On October 1st, 2010, I invited to Harvard representatives of the great private foundations in the US, leaders of libraries, and computer scientists. We had a day and a half of discussion, and I sent them a one-page description of a possible digital public library that would be free. Within a half an hour of the beginning of this debate, they said, we'll do it, it's a good idea, and we will provide the money. So we will create a coalition of foundations, not the government, but private foundations, to come up with the money, to do the digitizing, and we, in the research libraries, will provide the books. Now, that sounds simple. In fact, it's very complicated. We've been working at it for 2 years, but we will create, I hope, the greatest library that ever existed, not just for the US, but for Brazil and the whole world. It will be, we call it, Digital Public Library of America, and we are going to get it up and running next April, April 2013, in a preliminary form, but we will begin something like your public television here. It will be a public library, all of it digital, and we will, so to speak, share the intellectual wealth of our great libraries, such as Harvard's, which is the largest university library in the world, 17 million volumes. We will digitize them and make them available free of charge to everyone. Now, that may sound utopian, and in a way it was the utopian dream of the philosophers of the 18th century, but they did not have the internet. They had the printing press in a largely illiterate society. We have the internet. We can make it happen, and we will make it happen.
Professor Rob,
A Lili vai fazer uma pergunta.
de uma espécie de república das letras, mas nesse caso virtual, não é? A minha dúvida é, eu acho que é a pergunta que não quer calar, porque nos seus livros parece que o senhor não tem medo da morte, né? As ideias não morrem, os filósofos morrem, mas as ideias ficam, as bibliotecas não morrem, mas os livros podem morrer. Então, na sua opinião, essa pergunta de todos, né? Os livros vão morrer? Ou seja, estou vendo essa república virtual. E os livros, né? Como é que ficam? O senhor tem um Kindle, um iPad, por exemplo?
I read books on paper. I prefer printed books of the old-fashioned kind, but I'm a great believer in the digital future. And even the digital present, because we're already in the digital world. But I think people oversimplify when they say it's either digital or analog. People love to dramatize, and it sounds dramatic, you know. We live in the information age, as if other ages had no information. Of course they had information. It traveled by different means, by graffiti and street songs and pamphlets and printed books. But when you say the book is dead, I disagree. I think the book is more alive than ever. And we can prove it because we have statistics. I believe in Brazil, publishing is flourishing, publishing of the traditional printed book. China has doubled its book production in 10 years. In England, old-fashioned England, more books are published each year than ever. There was it was called the Spectacular Thursday for publishing. in which 800 books were published on the same day, on October 1st, 2011. For the first time now, more than 1 million new books in print, on paper, are being produced worldwide. So the curve goes up and up and up. Book production is doing very well, thank you. Now that may sound too optimistic. Of course, lots of people are having difficulties. Many publishers, especially booksellers, book chains are now having difficulties. And many people feel confused about the viability of business plans. So I'm not trying to oversimplify and say everything is great, but I am saying we can prove that people love the printed book. Now that does not exclude the digital book. So in my opinion, we are living through a period of transition, and that's why it's so interesting. Because everything is fluid, everything is changing, and therefore it's a moment of great possibility when, well, one possibility is to create a digital public library of America.
O senhor compra muitos livros digitais, professor, para a Biblioteca de Harvard?
O senhor falou
O senhor compra muitos livros digitais para a Biblioteca de... Qual é a proporção entre livros digitais e livros impressos? Desculpa, Cassiano, você já fala.
Well, we buy an enormous amount, not only of digital books, but of digital databases, and of course electronic journals. Now the exact proportion, I could almost give it to you in dollars, and I could be slightly wrong, but we spend about $40 million a year on acquisitions, and of them maybe 7 million for digital works. But many of those are digital academic journals. And that's another danger because, as you probably know, the publishers of these academic journals, which are crucial, especially in the hard sciences, put up the prices, up. There has been an inflation of 400% in the price of learned journals since the mid-1980s, compared with the consumer price index, which has only gone up 70%. So publishers realize that they can make a fortune by exploiting the demand for scientific knowledge. And this is hurting libraries terribly. So yes, we buy at Harvard an enormous amount of digital material. It costs too much. And we have to do something to stop the inflation of digital learning. So that's another example of commercialization because they control access to books. There are 3 publishers that control 42% of all scientific articles. And they make a lot of money, a huge amount of money. I'm not afraid to say it. If you take Elsevier, in the year 2010, they made £2 billion sterling in England. And their profit was 36% of £2 billion. Now that's a rather large profit margin. How can they do it? Well, they have us by the neck in academic libraries. We must buy their journals because our researchers say this is our access to knowledge. So we have to find a way to fight back. And that's why I say the danger of commercialization could outweigh the danger of democratization. It's a very, very great problem. And it's a paradox, because when you think of it, we, the academics, do the research, we write the articles, we referee the articles, we serve on the editorial boards, all of it for free, and then we buy back the product of our own labor at outrageous prices. So the basic economics of academic publishing is crazy. That's another thing we must stop, in my opinion.
Professor, por favor, aqui no Brasil essa mesma questão está acontecendo em relação à digitalização por parte de estudantes que estão formando redes de digitalização de livros para democratizar o acesso aos textos ao ver desses estudantes, que é proibitivo pelo custo e por questões de distribuição. O senhor colocou agora há pouco a exploração comercial do Google como um problema central na sua crítica a essa digitalização. O senhor acredita num trabalho colaborativo, que não vise o lucro, mas que vise a constituição de acervos de livros digitais? Por exemplo, na América Latina, na Argentina, já existem grandes sites de livros de humanas, de humanidades, que são compartilhados por estudantes sem fins lucrativos. O senhor acredita nisso?
Well, I do believe in this, but I'm also trying to be realistic. So I may sound utopian. You know, a college professor lives in the 18th century, loves the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, and dreams dreams. I want to fight that tendency by saying we should be realistic, we must have business plans, we must cover our costs. Of course, knowledge should be free, but it costs money to produce the knowledge. So there's a distinction between two kinds of freedom, what economists distinguish as free beer versus free speech. So, of course, we need cooperative arrangements of the kind you suggest. And we are doing this with our Digital Public Library of America. So we went to Europe, where there is Europeana, and that is an attempt to amalgamate different digitized databases in 27 European countries. We decided we would design our technological infrastructure to be compatible with Europeana. And that means that when we grow and grow as a library, we will do it with Europe, and we will have a transatlantic open source world of learning. Now, I hope that happens in Brazil, and that the same thing should be linked. It's very feasible. We have terrific technology, so I don't think this is utopian at all, and I applaud your students who are trying to get access to knowledge. But we have to respect copyright. So I'm not for a moment arguing that we should infringe copyright. That's a problem. If we want to make these books available, we must do so in a way that will respect the intellectual rights of the authors and the publishers. In the United States, every book up after 1923 is covered by copyright. And that means that almost the entire 20th century is off limits for an open access digital library. What are we going to do about it? You know, I think that's our greatest problem. It's a bigger problem than the technology, than the money, than the sources. And so we have a series of teams working on the legal problems to find a way to respect copyright and yet to make the books available. Not easy, but we must do it.
Agora nós vamos para um rápido intervalo no Roda Viva. Daqui a pouco a gente volta com o professor Robert Darnton. O Roda Viva recebe o diretor executivo das Bibliotecas de Harvard, Robert Darnton. Eu passo a palavra para o Cassiano Machado fazer uma pergunta.
Professor, você já salientou diversas vezes que cerca de 3/4 da produção de cinema pré-45, 3/4 da produção de cinema mudo sumiu para sempre. A gente estava conversando aqui sobre estratégias de digitalização dos livros e você menciona as 17 milhões de exemplares da Biblioteca de Harvard. Eu pergunto o que vocês estão fazendo para preservar as cerca de 676 milhões de páginas de website que existem hoje no ar, ou seja, como vocês estão se estruturando. Você mencionou rapidamente compra de bancos de dados, de bases de dados, mas eu queria saber como que vocês estão pensando a preservação dessa memória digital, até porque não existe nenhuma prova de que o digital sobreviva tanto tempo quanto o papel, né?
It's a very important question. So in planning the Digital Public Library of America, we are allocating 20% of costs for preservation. We're putting aside money to preserve digital texts, and also texts not just of books, but of films, recordings, everything. However, you're right, no one has solved the problem of how to save digital texts. So what do? You know, the ones and the zeros that make up a digital text unravel. They come apart. And not only that, the software becomes obsolete, the hardware becomes obsolete, and worst of all, the metadata becomes obsolete. Now, most people, they say, metadata? What is that? It's your way of finding a text in cyberspace. So the text may be perfect, but if you can't find it, it's gone. At Harvard, we have an enormous area for preserving digital texts by migrating them from one format to another. And we have an electric eye that reads spinning digital texts and spots the unraveling of the ones and the zeros. We substitute formats. We keep them in 3 different places. We work very hard and spend a lot of money to preserve these texts. But it's a temporary solution. I'm waiting for some great scientist to come up with the answer. But while waiting, we have a responsibility to future generations to preserve these things. So in the Digital Public Library of America, we will preserve the texts. And we are doing it at Harvard in a big way, and so are other great research libraries. But your question was also, what about websites?
Yeah.
Not easy. So we have developed a new program at Harvard to preserve and to create intercommunication of all the websites at Harvard. We have more than 1,000 websites. Every professor creates his own website and then collects data around it. They're very interesting. Their life expectancy is 44 days. I mean, worldwide, a website normally lasts 44 days. So websites come, they go, and yet they have very valuable material on them. Now, there is a kind of genius called Brewster Kahle. You may not have heard of him, but he went to MIT. He invented new technological breakthroughs. He made millions of dollars. And then he got tired of making money, and he decided he would preserve websites. He invented something called the Wayback Machine, and it takes photographs of all the websites, and he preserves it. That's the beginning of an answer. It's not the final answer, but I'm trying to say that we take seriously this problem in the U.S. We haven't solved it, but we're working on it.
E o senhor
Professor,
que
o senhor está
trabalhou...
falando
Só complementando.
Só para puxar para a história um pouquinho, que porque o senhor está falando tanto em preservar, né, o way back. O seu trabalho como historiador, eu queria fazer uma ligação entre o seu trabalho como historiador e agora o seu trabalho em Harvard, né? O seu trabalho como historiador, o senhor é conhecido como um dos introdutores dessa voga da história cultural, né? Na sua opinião e no seu trabalho com o passado, O senhor concorda com o jargão de que também a história é um passado distante, né? Mais ainda, piadas e gatos são bons para pensar, ou então a gente pode dizer que todo historiador é um bom fofoqueiro, como assim, nos seus livros?
Well, you know, Stendhal wrote in one of his notebooks, "Gossip is what historians should study." Gossip and anecdotes is where true history exists. So in one of my last book, well, actually my two last books, I did a study of gossip, of anecdotes, of stories as they floated through the air in Paris around 1750, 1789, through the French Revolution. I'm convinced that the means of communication 200, 300 years ago were crucial in history. And furthermore, we historians can discover those means of communication, especially in France, because the French had a modern police force. I love the French police. I don't like the American police quite as much, but the French police had special inspectors for literature. They kept track of all the writers they could find. And these files, manuscript files, I've studied. They found 500 authors in Paris around 1750. They included Montesquieu, Diderot, Rousseau, and Voltaire, all the great writers, and next to them, hundreds and hundreds of writers that no one's ever heard of. But these people are producing pamphlets. They are going to cafes and gossiping. They're spreading information. And I think the spread of information is one of the most fascinating things we can do in history. So we can recreate actual communication circuits. And well, my last book, called Poetry and the Police, is a study based on police files in which they arrest a person for reciting in public a poem attacking Madame de Pompadour. They interrogate him, they say, "Where did you get that poem?" He's A. He said, "I got it from B." They arrest B. "I got it from C." They arrest C. "I got it from D." They arrest D, and he said, "Well, I got it from E, but I also got 3 other poems and songs from X, Y, and Z." And they keep arresting people, interrogating them in the Bastille, and you can create the actual communication circuit that existed at this time, which was a time of political crisis. Now, what I find especially interesting is that most of these poems were set to music. So people are singing new verses to old tunes every day in Paris. I found hundreds, thousands of them. And I believe that street songs were a kind of newspaper at a time when there were no real newspapers in Paris and when most people could not read. So we need to study songs, and not only to study them, but to hear them. So they say, sung to the tune of La Béquille du Père Barnabas. No one has ever heard of that tune, but in a section of the Biblioteque nationale de France, they have a registry where you look up the title of a tune, you get the musical annotation, and a friend of mine called Hélène Delaveau, who is a cabaret performer in Paris, has recorded the tunes, the actual songs that one of them brought down the government in April 1749. So there's a political crisis, a police crisis, and a new kind of communication. She recorded the songs, and in the book, the reader can read in an appendix the words of the songs in English and in French, and then online can listen to Hélène Delaveau sing the songs. So it's as if you can hear the past. We can, thanks to modern technology, the internet, we can reconstruct the world of sound, not perfectly, but pretty well, as it existed 250 years ago. So this takes me, my enthusiasm for this kind of history, I think, is linked to the problem of the internet today and the attempt to capture all of the media as they exist, whether they are blogs or websites or even digitized version of books.
O professor tem historiador brasileiro, o professor Boris Fausto, ele faz uma pergunta também sobre narrativa de história. Vamos ouvi-lo para o senhor responder.
Professor Darnton, cada vez mais é frequente que jornalistas façam trabalhos históricos ou construam narrativas históricas. Como o senhor avalia o trabalho dos jornalistas? Eles não fazem história ou eles são importantes porque com uma narrativa bem urdida, eles conseguem chegar mais perto à consideração, à percepção do leitor, que é uma coisa que sempre, pelo que eu saiba, o preocupa. Isto é, precisamos chegar ao leitor. Os acadêmicos precisam chegar ao leitor. Mas a pergunta é sobre como é que o senhor avalia a presença dos jornalistas que narram história.
Well, I have great respect for journalists. I was a journalist myself. Everyone in my family worked for the New York Times, my father, my mother, my brother. I think journalists are the salt of the earth. And when I left the New York Times, it broke my mother's heart. He became a professor, and it was a tragedy for the family. You know, among journalists, there is a saying. In fact, there are two sayings. One is, today's newspaper is the first draft of history. Sounds good? I don't believe it. The second saying is, nothing is more dead than yesterday's newspaper. If I could tell a story about my own experience, I should explain that I intended to become a newspaper reporter. In my family, we don't say journalist, we say newspaper reporter. And so I went to police headquarters in Newark, New Jersey as a college student and spent my summer vacation learning how to do reporting. But news is not something you know automatically. News is something you have to learn. It's a convention that is passed on by professionals who know how to cover stories. So when I was in Newark, the professionals spent all of their time in police headquarters playing poker. And I was the person who went upstairs to the lieutenant who kept a record of every complaint and wrote it out on little slips of paper called squeal sheets. I would come down with maybe 20 squeal sheets every half hour and read them to the poker game to find out what was news, because it was not obvious. I didn't know how to do news, but they did. So someone steals a pair of shoes in a store of some sort, not news. And I go through the whole stack of things, and little by little, I get an idea of how the professionals, what they think is a story. Now, one day, I was reading these sheets as I came down the stairs to the poker game. And I found a sheet that said homicide, rape, and incest. I thought, wonderful. This is a terrific news. And instead of going to the poker game, I went directly to the homicide squad, and I said to the lieutenant in charge, here's this wonderful news. Can you give me some details? He took the sheet of paper, he looked at it, and he said to me, I was then maybe 19 years old, he said, kid, this is not news. Why? I said. Well, after the name of the victim, there was the letter B in parentheses. And after the name of the suspect was the letter B in parentheses. And I never paid any attention to the B's, but of course it stood for black.
Black
Otherwise, there was a W for white. And it turned out that black people were not news. I mean, this was in the days before really serious desegregation. And so it's a long answer to your question, but I would say that, first of all, news involves training in a profession that has sort of culturally determined notions of how to construct a narrative that they call news. And secondly, there's a kind of filtering process that, in this case, cut out black people. So when I read a newspaper as an historian, I take it seriously as a story about what happened, but I don't think it's a clear window into what happened. And therefore, in my opinion, historians can learn a lot from journalists. And I respect journalists, but I don't think the newspaper is the first draft of history. I think historians must go deeper, and they must be skeptical about newspapers as a source of what happened.
Mas o senhor, ao mesmo tempo que o senhor diz que respeita os jornalistas e o jornalismo, blogs, do que as fontes primárias da notícia, entrevistar as pessoas e, enfim, pesquisar nos arquivos. A gente sabe que a tecnologia aumenta incrivelmente, potencializa incrivelmente a nossa capacidade de fazer bobagens, né? E ela também aumenta incrivelmente a capacidade dos jornalistas de serem levianos, serem superficiais. O senhor, claro, sem correr o risco da generalização, que é um crime quando se fala em jornalismo, o senhor acha que o jornalismo, de forma geral, está se tornando mais superficial e leviano com o avanço da tecnologia?
You know, I agree, it's a real problem. Now, maybe it's not so severe in Brazil as in the US, but we are living through a crisis of the daily printed newspaper. There's no question. And a lot of it is economic, because want ads, these little ads that explain where jobs are being offered, what's for sale, they have migrated from the printed newspaper to the internet. And the cost now of the printed newspaper is impossible. So newspapers are disappearing. Last week, the famous Times-Picayune of New Orleans disappeared. Many, many newspapers have done so. And what is replacing them? Well, as you ask, is it the blog? I think in large part it is. And my students go to blogs to get information, but how reliable is that information? And what sort of research goes into the reports that you read on the blogs? I agree that the blogosphere tends to be superficial and is not an adequate replacement for the daily printed newspaper. So myself, I'm very worried about the future of journalism. Now, there's some good things as well. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Wikipedia. So Wikipedia began with uncertain information, but they changed, and they have serious editors, and it's become a worldwide encyclopedia that taps the knowledge of many, many people. But it's not a newspaper. So I don't have an answer to your question. All I can say is I share your worry.
Professora Beatriz, uma pergunta, por favor?
Sim, o senhor viaja do século XVIII aos dias atuais com bastante frequência. O senhor tem um livro sobre Berlim durante a queda do muro, que é um livro belíssimo. Podemos dizer que os historiadores hoje fazem o que a gente chama de história do tempo presente, e os jornalistas estariam fazendo a história do instante, né? Como é que o senhor analisa um pouco essas classificações que a historiografia deu a esses dois universos de pesquisa?
Well, it's true. It so happened that I was in Berlin in the year 1989-1990. And there I was writing another monograph about the 18th century where I live. I believe the Cold War would exist to the end of my life and well beyond. But the ground was shaking nonetheless. There were demonstrations in East Berlin, and I was in West Berlin, and I could go to them. I could get on the U-Bahn in the subway and actually watch the demonstrations and interrogate people. So I found that I left behind my monograph on the 18th century, and I spent the rest of the year interviewing people, going to demonstrations, watching events. And I became a kind of journalist once again. But I think I also attempted, at least, to be an anthropologist. By the people. And so I wrote essays on things such as how do East Germans see money? Because the Deutsche Mark in West Germany was all-powerful. East German money was trivial. How do they understand time? You know, a traffic light in East Germany took much longer than a traffic light in West Germany. And people, they relaxed, they took life easy, they were not rushing to make more money. The whole ethos of East Germany was different. And by attempting to combine anthropology and journalism, I wrote a book called Berlin Journal that at least gave you some impressions of this. Now, I don't think it's adequate as a history of the great year 1989-90, but I think it's a good testimony to that history. Someone much better than I will write that history someday, but we have come to the end of the Cold War. We live in a new world, and I was fortunate enough to be a witness to this. So I hope I've answered your question. I'm not sure I have, but I think we can combine forms of journalism and forms of history to develop new ways of apprehending things. And that's exciting, it's thrilling, and it's also something made possible by the internet, because we get photographs and recordings on Facebook and Twitters and so on. The Arab Spring demonstrated that the means of communication are really shaping the way events happen. I believe profoundly that the perception of events is as important as events. I don't know if you agree or not, but they're all mixed up together. And so we need a history of perception and communication along with an account of what happened.
Nós vamos fazer mais um rápido intervalo e já voltamos com o professor Robert Darnton. No centro do Roda Viva, temos hoje o historiador americano Robert Darnton. Professor, o senhor mencionou no bloco passado que essa Biblioteca Digital da América, que está sendo formada, é só com fundações. Por que não se chamou o Estado? Por que não se chamou o governo? Qual a filosofia que está por trás disso?
Whether it's a philosophy, I don't know. But in the U.S., we're skeptical about the government. That's not a sign of civic health. But the American Congress is stalemated today. It's failed to do anything of great significance. So I think that we're living through a period of great disaffection towards government. And that's not good, but it exists. One thing we do have that I believe is good and is rather original in the United States are private foundations devoted to the public good. The Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, the Gates Foundation, there are many of them, and they take their mission seriously. They have a lot of money, and they invest it in ways that they think will improve civic life, health, education, etc. So when we devised a plan to create the Digital Public Library of America, we went to the foundations. We did not go to the government. And the foundation said, it's a good idea, we will support it. Now, the support so far is very generous. It's enough money to go through the preparatory stages. That will take us to April 2013. After that, it will grow and grow and grow. And so what began as $5 million to get organized will be $100 million soon. But with $100 million, we can digitize a very great number of books. And I think that we are aiming this library not at other professors, not just at sophisticated researchers, but at ordinary people. And in particular, at the community colleges. Those are colleges for people who don't go to study in a university for 4 years, but are trying to catch up because they fell off the rails at some point and prepare for higher education. Many of them do not have good libraries, these community colleges. There are 13 million students in community colleges. They need an excellent research library. They need curators who can help them understand how to use databases, and we will supply that as well. So what the foundations are doing is making possible an outreach to the general public, to ordinary people, including old age people in nursing homes, and people who are scattered everywhere, independent writers who don't have access to a great library. We can do this thanks not to Congress and Washington, but thanks to the foundations.
É grande, é forte a tradição americana das fundações. Agora, em última instância, as fundações estão também na mão de grandes empresas de propriedade privada que não têm controle democrático, que também são movidas pelo lucro. Não é o modelo europeu, principalmente na França, onde o Estado faz tudo. O senhor tem preferência por algum desses modelos ou não?
Well, if we had an enlightened state, I would be delighted. And I think that the French, for example, have a new copyright law. It's very interesting. It might work. I think that the French investment in culture is serious, and I've participated in some of their projects, which I admire. But I do not agree that the foundations are profit-minded.
Não, estão na mão de empresas que são profit-minded.
I disagree, honestly, because they are created by companies who made a lot of money. Bill Gates, Microsoft. But they are created with complete autonomy. They're independent of influence from these companies. And if the companies try to interfere, then that would be illegal because it would violate their tax-exempt status. So the foundations have to provide reports. They must be transparent. They're examined very carefully. And if there is any sign of manipulation by companies, then that won't work. So I actually have faith in the private foundations that is even greater, I hate to say it, than my faith in the House of Representatives in Washington. Now, maybe that will change. We will have elections in November, we'll see. But meanwhile, we have to get on with the business of stopping the commercialization of the internet and creating an internet for the public good. We can do it thanks to the foundations.
Paulo, você quer fazer uma pergunta, por favor?
Sim, o senhor criticou agora o Congresso, no entanto, o Congresso americano é dono da talvez mais importante biblioteca do mundo atualmente. Não seriam capazes de fundar uma biblioteca digital à altura da Biblioteca do Congresso?
I think the short answer is yes. And I hope they do it. The Library of Congress has done wonderful digital projects. There is one called American Memory, in which they've digitized different sectors of their collections concerning slavery, the Civil War, the American Revolution. This is all good, but they have not taken the lead in creating an exhaustive digital library that will bring the entire contents of our collections to the American people free of charge. Why not? Well, I don't know, but you know, they are under the control of Congress. And so maybe there's resistance there, it's hard to say. But I think we can't wait for Congress or the Library of Congress to take the initiative. We should do it ourselves.
Professor, em 1994, na revista Wired, o John Perry Barlow escreveu um famoso artigo no qual ele fala uma frase que vem sendo repetida infinitamente, que é: o conteúdo vai ser livre na cultura digital, a experiência vai ser paga. Eu queria saber se o senhor concorda com esse tipo de afirmação e como que essa biblioteca digital das Américas está se preparando para lidar com esse tipo de questão, ou seja, pelo que eu entendi, o acesso vai ser livre a todos os conteúdos, mas o senhor acha que algum tipo de experiência vai ser criada a partir disso para as pessoas que vão usufruir disso?
Yes. Now, I'm not sure I've understood your question, so let me turn it around. The famous remark is, information wants to be free. Is that true? Well, does information have wants in the first place? It's a metaphorical way of saying, in principle, information should be like the air we breathe, free to everyone. But the practice is very different because information is communicated usually by private corporations, and they do it in order to make money. And I'm not saying that's wrong or evil, that's the way a capitalist society operates. But it doesn't mean we can't operate in a different way if we consider the public good.
Mas se a gente trocar,
Yes.
desculpe, vou puxar com a sua experiência do século XVIII. Quando o senhor analisa o século XVIII, o senhor chama a atenção que existe essa república das letras, né, do Enlightenment, mas que esse mundo dos livros é muito perigoso, porque ele é cheio de atravessadores, de censores, de piratas, não é? De boatos. Isso não vai acontecer nessa república das letras, enfim, virtual. Como é o conflito nesse lugar? Porque há tanto conflito no 18, né? Talvez estou tentando só...
Sim.
Yes.
Sim.
I think we'll have more than in the 18th century. The idea of a life without conflict is naive. So what I'm trying to present is a realistic, street-smart plan to make something happen in the public good. Much as I invoke Condorcet or other philosophers of the Enlightenment, I don't want it to sound too utopian, even though I believe really in utopias.
I know.
I want to have a business plan. We must confront costs and conflicts. And that's healthy. So, for example, we created a headquarters at Harvard to do the planning. And then we created 6 working groups scattered around America. They brought more people in, and they disagree. There's lots of conflict. What should be the content or the limits of the content in this future library? Well, some people say, no limits. Let's go right up to the present. I disagree. I think we should stay out of the current commercial network for books and music and film, and maybe have our collections going up to 10 years ago with a moving wall so that each year it advances 10 years behind the current market. That way we are not a threat to publishers and authors who must make money from selling their books and other products. So yes, that's an example of conflict. I think that we will run into much disagreement. We don't know where the headquarters are going to be. Should it be in the Middle West, Chicago? Should it be in Cambridge, where we have a lot of talent? Maybe San Francisco? There are lobbies arguing for each one. Who's going to govern it? Will we have a board of trustees? Who will sit on it? Who will choose those people? Well, there will be conflict. And I think out of the conflict, we will actually create more energy. So it will be the shock of people arguing different positions, and we will do it publicly. We have regular meetings. Every meeting is transparent. The public is invited to take place, and they have lots of criticism. So yes, I invite conflict, and I think that it's healthy, and that it would be naive if we simply thought, well, we have a good idea, now let's actually utilize it. No, we have to get the ideas from the ground up, and a lot are coming, especially from public libraries who at first were worried about the digital public library of America because they said, well, if you're a public library, we won't get funding from the municipal authorities that pay for our budget. And so they were very skeptical, and we had a debate. We invited them to join our, we call it a directive committee, and they have joined. And we are now designing things so as to reinforce the public libraries instead of undercutting them. So yes, we have conflict. We live in a real world, and I think that's fine.
Professor,
o senhor fala... Calma. O Paulo, depois a Beatriz, por favor.
O senhor fala aqui a questão dos livros, o senhor diz que no mundo de excesso de informação, os editores serão cada vez mais necessários. Poucas páginas depois, o senhor fala nos 40 anos em que de relação do senhor com Robert Silvers no New York Review of Books. Eu gostaria que o senhor falasse desse editor, que é um editor mítico em Nova York, que marcou a época, e se ele teria lugar nesse novo mundo aí que estamos construindo.
Robert Silvers. He is, I think, a great man. He created the New York Review of Books, which is a force, not just in the US, but everywhere, I think. It set a new level of public discourse. I've written for them, I think, now 40 years. He's a wonderful editor. He's taught me a great deal. And I think that that's an example of a kind of private initiative that can make a difference in the public sphere. Now, your question is, how will someone like Robert Silvers be part of the Digital Public Library of America? Well, I don't know. Of course, now he's a friend of mine, and I would love to have him a member maybe of our board of trustees to give advice, but it's not as if we are thinking of creating a DPLA review of books or anything like that.
Mas eu estou falando mais sobre o papel desse editor à moda antiga, que discute o texto com o autor, que volta, que produz uma publicação única nesse novo mundo digital, não só na biblioteca.
Well, you know, the New York Review of Books has an electronic edition. It has a blog. It's converted itself from the world of print into the world of electronic communication. And I think it does very well in both worlds. In fact, that illustrates my argument. I believe that it's quite wrong to see a kind of diametrical opposition between the digital and the analog, as if they occupied opposite extremes on some technological spectrum. I think that's misunderstanding things. In fact, I believe they are complementary, and that there are lots of hybrid works that are both digital and analog, and they are mutually supportive. And there are some studies that indicate that if a book is available digitally, it sells more copies in print. Now, maybe that's not proven, we don't know, you know, the future is uncertain, but I actually think that the awareness of a new publication is promoted by digital means. A problem for many university presses especially, or specialized presses, is they don't get their books in bookstores. And then bookstores are beginning to disappear. So we need a way to make readers aware of these new cultural products, and I think the internet works very well in this respect. Is that an answer to your question, or have I not grasped it?
Professora Beatriz, por favor.
Professor, o senhor constantemente está falando da digitalização dos livros. Eu queria falar do pesquisador. Assim, eu acho que nós somos pesquisadores dinossauros que estamos acabando, porque eu gosto de arquivo, eu gosto de documento, e cada vez mais essa experiência não vai acontecer de novo. Como diretor de instituição, eu sei que é bom que o pesquisador não venha, porque protege o documento e eu posso democratizar o acesso. Mas já se notou que o Google, por exemplo, ele conhece o seu vício de pesquisa e acaba te induzindo sempre aos mesmos resultados. E como professor, às vezes eu tento fazer os alunos levantarem da frente do computador e ir à biblioteca, e ir ao arquivo, e eles não querem mais, eles querem resolver tudo por ali. Como resolver esse dilema de que é muito importante digitalizar para dar acesso, mas ao mesmo tempo a gente não está mais criando aquele pesquisador, como o senhor diz, que ao se deparar com uma estranheza no documento, então invista na estranheza, né?
Yes. It's a real problem. I think it's primarily a pedagogical problem that you have experienced yourself, and I do too. So my students also, they go right to Google. And then I say, well, yes, but where did that information come from that you saw on Google? And they say, well, it came from cyberspace. What is cyberspace, you know? And, well, they think it's a kind of mythical world out there where information is floating around. They don't understand it's actually wired. There is the physical connections. And those physical connections can be blocked by sensors. We know in China they have very sophisticated techniques of blocking websites. And of course the Chinese try to get around them, and there's a cat and mouse game that goes on every day in China. Fascinating. That itself is a subject for research. But if I could revert to my experience, which I think is like yours, I've spent many months, years in the Archives Nationales in Paris. So you order a box of documents. You don't know what's in the box, but you think maybe there's some correspondence between the intendant and the minister of the king's household. You don't know. The box arrives. They always have a little ribbon on the side. You take apart the ribbon, you fold back the cover, and there are dossiers. You take out a dossier and you start reading. And somewhere out of reading letter after letter, memoir after memoir, hundreds and thousands, you have to write history. Now, none of that is available on the internet. Anyone who has had the experience, as I think you have, of the archives knows that they go on forever. I mean, thousands and thousands of kilometers of documents that no one has ever seen. I believe that we don't know most history, because history happens to everyone. And usually it's written from the top down. It's about kings and queens and generals and politicians. But we want to recover the history of ordinary human beings. And to do that, you have to go to other sources. It's very difficult. I'm sure you've done the same thing. I know Brazil has great historians who have worked out a way to get at the history of everyday life of common people, but it's a lot of labor, and it's thrilling. So I find I try to communicate to my students the excitement of a new box of documents in which you don't know what's there. And so I reproduce some of the, a box from the Archives de la Bastille, the Bastille archives, and I give one copy to each student, and then we read them together, and they puzzle over the handwriting. It's really quite easy to read, but they're not used to it. So they get one word after another, and they begin to read better, and at the end of a letter, I say to them, what does the letter mean? And usually they haven't thought of that because they're thinking so hard about the handwriting, they're not interpreting it. And then you feel the excitement of actually making contact with other minds, the mind that wrote this letter. Not perfect contact, I'm not a romantic, but serious contact in which you can, little by little, working harder and harder, get a full picture of life lived by ordinary people. So I think that as professors, you and I should try to get across the excitement of research that is way beyond Google, but takes you into the depths of how most human beings actually lived in the past.
Eu vou chamar agora um último intervalo e daqui a pouco a gente volta para o quarto bloco do Roda Viva. Esse é o último bloco do Roda Viva e no centro da arena o professor Robert Darnton. Professor Darnton, eu sei que o senhor não está íntimo da situação brasileira, de arquivos. Aqui ainda há muita coisa por se fazer. Que sugestão geral o senhor daria para os pesquisadores brasileiros, para as universidades brasileiras, para o Estado brasileiro? Por onde começar?
Well, I'm feeling very reticent about telling other people how to do
Não, mas
things.
como caminhos gerais.
But in a general way, I would recommend that beginning students be exposed to the excitement of archival research by receiving photocopies of documents, by going to the archives, and by debating what the meaning of documents is. You can do this very effectively in small groups. Sometimes you can give lectures about it. I think PowerPoint techniques in which you can make sound and music and images come together are very effective. I think also that it's crucial for there to be enough support for students who have a vocation for doing research. That means scholarships. Because if someone is 18, 22, the economic pressure can be so great that they just give up. So, of course, the state should invest in research. I'm in favor of investing in computer technology and chemistry and physics and medicine, but why not invest in history as well? Well, I think it's important for the Brazilians to understand their history because it gives you another dimension in life. In the United States, I think we are too superficial. We don't have a deep historical understanding of where we came from. In Brazil, I've read some of your wonderful historians. One is here, Lily Schwartz. And I think that you have such talent that you can go far back into the past and understand something like slavery and its long-term effects. So that, I would think, matters terribly for the Brazilians' identity, for their self-consciousness. And you need good historians to do it. And I think also the collaboration of students who come up with the new ideas.
Posso sugerir mais um elemento? Porque eu acho que aqui nós temos um problema de básico, talvez aqui a Beatriz pode me ajudar, mas é um problema de apoio do Estado. Eu sei que o senhor é suspeito, né, tem a ver com suspeição do Estado, mas apoio do Estado aos nossos arquivos, né, que infelizmente passam por um problema muito grande, né, de catalogação, de preservação e de proteção. Então, o problema que nós vivemos é assim, como é que nós vamos incentivar os alunos a irem aos arquivos se os arquivos também não podem controlar, né? Não há um controle dos documentos, há um medo de roubo, há um medo de todo tipo de problema, né? Há um conselho por aí, como agir nesse sentido, mais estrutural?
Eu só queria dizer que a gente melhorou muito, mas temos um longo caminho pela frente. E acho que a primeira noção é se trabalhar em rede. Acho que os arquivos estão aprendendo no Brasil que eles precisam trabalhar de forma contínua, conjugada. E isso tem nos ajudado bastante, mas temos um longo caminho pela frente.
Yes. Well, I agree that working in groups is wonderful. And so the students support each other and they debate, they disagree, they often read complementary documents, and out of that community experience, you create a kind of consciousness, an esprit de corps that will reinforce the study of history. Now, I have no easy answer to the problem of policing archives and organizing them and keeping them straight. I guess what I would say is it matters. It's important. It's not a luxury. It's a necessity. A country should understand where it came from. And there is no single answer to it. You have to have a debate, a dialogue, disagreement. That's, I think, part of civic health. So I would hope that the Brazilian politicians understand that too, or the Brazilian government, the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Education. They could appreciate that this will be a vital force in what I think is a kind of renaissance you're going through now. So if it's a period of economic growth and intellectual prosperity, take the archives into it and make that part of it. I'm sure you could do it because you've already done it in writing such good history. So let's broaden that and welcome in students who will come with new ideas and new questions.
Cassiano.
Professor, você agora há pouco falou sobre a experiência de abrir uma caixa e ler documentos antigos, e acho que todo mundo que assistiu viu a paixão com a qual o senhor falou a respeito disso. Eu pergunto se, com todas essas atividades agora para proteger, criar uma biblioteca digital mundial, americana, se o senhor consegue ter tempo para fazer esse tipo de pesquisa. E aproveito para perguntar também se o senhor, que escreve muito bem, acho que qualquer pessoa que lê os seus livros vê que o senhor tem uma escrita muito clara e de muita qualidade, se o senhor sonha em escrever ficção ou já escreveu ficção em algum momento. Então eu pergunto como escritor e como leitor.
No, I never dreamt of writing fiction. I used to write poetry a little bit, but fortunately that's all disappeared. I think writing is a great intellectual exercise, and it's hard work. So I write and I rewrite and I rewrite. I try to make outlines of what I've written as if someone else had written it, and then to rewrite it again so it's clear, and clear at the level of the sentence and of the general structure. For me, that's important. It's true that today the attempt to create a digital public library of America, for me, it's a great cause. And I'm devoting all of my time to that when I'm not teaching and not going to meetings to organize the library at Harvard. So there is no more time for going to the archives. However, I have done so much archival work that I can go back to that research. And you know, it's, if you saw it, you would be shocked because I take notes on index cards, and I put the cards in a shoebox, and I put the shoebox on a shelf. And now I take out cards that sometimes I've written 40 or 50 years ago. But the memory comes back, I read the cards, and I think there's enough intellectual capital to keep me going for a little while. And after that, I hope to go back to the archives and begin all over again. But thank you for your compliment. I really care about readers, and I think clarity is a great virtue. So even if one's not a great writer, one can be a clear writer and improve one's writing. I think that's available to everyone, so we can all do it.
Paulo, uma última pergunta, por favor.
Sim, o senhor, professor, nos bastidores me falou que após essa viagem vai voltar para casa, terminar o seu livro sobre censura. O senhor poderia falar um pouco sobre o que o senhor está planejando?
Yes. Well, this is an example of research I did in past years. The research is finished, and the point of the book is not to say censorship is good or censorship is bad. That's too easy. The purpose is to understand how censors did their job every day. What was censorship actually as it was experienced by the censors and as it was understood by the censors? Well, if you like, that's an anthropological question, you know, the natives' understanding of something. So I spent many years studying censorship in 18th century France, and I spent 2 summers studying censorship in the British Raj in India in the 19th century. And then I spent a lot of time studying censorship in communist East Germany, where I met the censors. I actually interviewed them. It was fascinating because they said to me first aggressively, "You have censorship in the US. It's the marketplace." Okay, I said, I know that. You're a censor. What do you understand as censorship? And there was a pause, and then in one word, they defined it: planning. Censorship is planning literature the way everything should be planned in a communist society. And then one of the censors reached into a drawer and pulled out the plan for East German literature in the year 1990. it was a year that never happened because the wall fell, but you could see what they meant. And that illustrates my general argument. I'm trying to see the way censorship functioned as an element in a different cultural system and to compare them across the way.
Wilson, uma última pergunta, por favor.
Claro. Professor, eu sei que a sua zona de conforto, você se sente mais à vontade falando do século XVIII, eu vou voltar só para o século XX, porque eu preciso contar uma história que se passou comigo, então não daria para ser no século XVIII. Mas, de toda forma, eu trabalhei na redação de uma revista 40 anos atrás, eu era jovem ainda, começando a minha carreira, e nessa redação tinha um escritor, um jornalista que era escritor também. E ele nos propôs uma coisa que é precursora da escrita colaborativa, que era, a cada dia, um de nós da redação, um dos repórteres, escrevia o capítulo de um livro. E isso foi indo. A gente escrevia, deixava em cima de uma geladeira, quem chegasse primeiro no dia seguinte continuava escrevendo o livro. Claro que isso não prosperou, porque cada um tinha suas pautas mais urgentes, mas aquilo, na verdade, seria impossível na era do livro impresso. Hoje, na era do livro digital, existe a crowdwriting, o open book, em que várias pessoas colaboram e escrevem de forma colaborativa, coletivamente. E o senhor já demonstrou aqui sua simpatia pela Wikipedia, que é justamente a enciclopédia colaborativa, em que todo mundo pode, com determinados filtros, colaborar para a elaboração dessa enciclopédia. O senhor acha que esse tipo de novo estilo, ou nova forma de se escrever livros, pode prosperar? É uma tendência? Isso pode se aplicar para romances, para literatura, ou só para livros científicos em que a colaboração já é tradicional?
It's very interesting. The short answer is I don't know. I hope so, because as an enthusiast about Wikipedia, the later Wikipedia, where there is control of crowdsourcing, I think it's opened up enormous possibilities. So, for example, sometimes I write something in the New York Review of Books, and the blogs take it up, and they find a mistake, or they disagree, or I see that I exaggerated or didn't add a nuance and so on. So I think that the feedback of the readers is a living experience today for authors. Now, why not collaborate? And I love your experiment of a novel which continues that way. I think whether it would work as a novel or not, I don't know, but I do believe that we are moving into an area of crowdsourcing, of drawing on the so-called wisdom of the crowds. Myself, I respect the intelligence of ordinary people. I try not to write down to them, and if they speak back up to me, it improves things. So again, this may sound naive, but I actually think we are experimenting with new genre, new ways of communication, and we're only beginning. So a lot of this will involve images, it will involve sound, it will involve mixing and mashing, as we say, and it will involve more people. So maybe the old days of the individual genius writer, you know, Victor Hugo, I think those days are over. And it was a romantic dream, the novelist as a culture hero. I don't believe in that anymore. I love novelists, but we're living in another world where this communal context is crucial, and so I hope we will invent new things of the sort you're describing.
Infelizmente, o programa vai ter que ser encerrado, o tempo já acabou. Eu agradeço a presença do professor Robert Darnton, da Beatriz Kuchnir, do Wilson Moerdau, do Paulo Werneck, do Cassiano Eric Machado e da Lilian Schwartz, e também do nosso cartunista, o Paulo Caruso. Boa noite e até a próxima semana.